Hello and welcome to the latest in a series of GSA Snapshot Webinars, where today we'll be addressing the important questions around private mobile networks. During these 30-minute sessions, we dig into a topic of interest to the global mobile ecosystem, drawing on the depth and breadth of GSA research to provide invaluable and unique insights into the current state of 4G and 5G networks, technologies, spectrum and devices globally. First, a little bit of housekeeping before we dive into today's GSA Snapshot. We're joined by Joe Barrett, President of GSA, and Simon Sherrington, GSA's Vice President of Research. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions throughout the event, just using the questions tab on the sidebar. Please do pose your questions as we go through the data and insights, and then we'll collate them and put them to Joe and Simon at the end of the session. The data presented today, including the latest GSA report on private mobile networks, will be shared with you immediately following this event. Today's GSA Snapshot webinar is on private mobile networks. And over the next 30 minutes, the team will address questions such as what defines a private mobile network, who are deploying them, where and for what, and what technologies and spectrum bands are being used in these deployments. But to get things started, I'll first hand over to Joe Barrett, President of GSA, who will share a brief update on the GSA's activities.
Thank you, Richard. So this is just a little bit of update for anybody who doesn't know about GSA and a little bit of maybe new things that are happening. So GSA has been representing the global mobile ecosystem and the suppliers and reporting on the industry since 1998. We've been developing, we have 3 reports, and hopefully you've downloaded many of those reports yourselves, and then a number of reports are for members and associates that contain a great deal of information on the industry, and that information is stored in our unique industry database, which is called GAMBOD. So all that data can be accessed by our members and associates who subscribe to access to that database. And as a point you may not know, but we are updating the GAMBOD user interface. So within the next few months, we'll have a new interface that will be easier for you to use for those members and for those associates. Hopefully you've seen a lot of changes over the past 5 or 6 years and the expanse of information that GSA is researching on. All of that is down to Simon, who you're going to hear from, and his excellent team. So that's been expanding, and we will continue to look at new areas. If you've got new areas you think we should research, please let us know. We have various groups, including probably the largest spectrum group in the industry. Last year we launched the Fixed Wireless Access Forum, which now has close to 45 members. So again, a very interesting area. We have a marketing interest group around private networks, and so that's open to GSA members and some associates. And then we have marketing and standardization. So lots of activity within GSA that your companies can get involved in as members, or get information to get access to more detailed information. If you want to subscribe to the database, just email us at admin@gsacom.com. And with that, I'll shut up and let you listen to Simon and what's happening over the next 30 minutes or so.
Thank you, Joe. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar, and thank you for joining us today. As billed, I'm Simon Sherrington, and I lead up the GSA's research activity. And I'm going to talk to you today about some work we've been doing in the area of private mobile networks, which is a rapidly expanding element of what's a much broader program of data collection, research and analysis that's made available to GSA members. To get us started, what are we talking about? So we've been evolving our definition of private mobile networks, helped by the new interest group within the GSA looking at that area. And we are tracking 3GPP based 4G LTE and 5G private mobile networks. and we are tracking those that are intended for the sole use or primary use of private entities such as companies, academic organisations and governments. We include within the market that we're looking at deployments based on multi-fire, future railway mobile communication systems. We are tracking networks using spectrum defined within 3GPP, and in broad terms, networks that are generally intended for business and mission critical operational needs. There are a number of things we exclude from our analysis. Generally, we're excluding networks that are offered to the general public. We don't want to track public networks. We exclude non-3GPP networks such as Wi-Fi, Tetra, P25, and you can see the others in the list there, Sigfox, LoRa, and then there's some other proprietary technologies. We're also excluding at the moment network slices, and there are quite a few grey zone examples that we sort of work our way through. So for instance, whilst we don't count networks that are generally offered to the general public, we would count, for example, a deployment by an academic institution that, as part of a multi-purpose installation providing on-campus services, also happen to provide mobile broadband to student homes in the wider area. So that's to give you a bit of perspective on what we include within the analysis, what we're counting. There are many other definitions out there. This is the one the GSA has focused on going forward. So to the market. The exact number of existing private mobile network deployments is quite hard to determine, as details are often not made public. Excluding companies holding CBRS priority access licenses in the USA, except those that we know are undertaking private rather than public mobile network projects using the spectrum, our available data shows that at least 626 companies or organisations across 55 countries or territories have been or are investing in private mobile networks based on LTE or 5G in the form of trials, pilot deployments, commercial network launches, or investment in licenses that would enable deployment of private LTE and 5G networks. And that's likely to be an underestimate of the overall market. So in order to improve information about this market, GSA is now maintaining a database of private LTE and 5G networks and spectrum worldwide. That database now catalogues specific information about those 626 organisations. Some of that information has been supplied confidentially, so we publish a subset of that database, which contains listings for nearly 400 organisations, now 393, for which we provide public details. And as you can see from the map, those 55 countries or territories, there are deployments or licenses being awarded in many parts of the world. Much of Europe, North America, Asia Pacific, Central and Latin America, and even some in parts of Africa. Why might an organisation want to deploy a private mobile network? Well, there are a variety of benefits that could include improved access to services. So private mobile networks help in locations that are not reached by public mobile networks, offering improved coverage indoors or in remote areas or in underground locations. They can offer improved security and data control with full separation from wider public networks. The network user can configure the security as they wish. Improved quality of service. So there are license exempt technologies, such as some of the ones I mentioned earlier, that can be deployed, but they can't always meet an organization's capacity, mobility, coverage, availability, latency, failover, or throughput requirements. Private mobile networks can be configured to deliver the quality of service that organizations want. The parameters of the networks can be configured and reconfigured to meet an organization's specifications. They offer increased flexibility. So mobile private networks as a replacement to fixed private networks can be used in dynamic environments where equipment needs to move about and where fixed cabling either gets in the way or is costly to keep reconfiguring or relocating. And there is possibility for wider integration with public mobile networks, where services are required outside the private campus or regional network, only realistically possible through roaming onto a public operator's mobile network. Private mobile networks can also deliver voice, including voice over LTE, and in the context of 5G standalone, we'll likely see deployments of voice over new radio coming soon. Text, data and video services, and they can be used to connect machines, sensors and devices and computing systems as well as people. And as a result of ongoing work by 3GPP, private mobile networks can also support mission-critical communications requirements, making them suitable as replacements for legacy systems, perhaps used by government and emergency services organisations. Where information is available, GSAs tracking the technologies being used in the private mobile networks, so LTE or 5G, and going forward we'll also be tracking deployments that we can identify as 5G standalone networks. It's also tracking whether networks are being deployed as pilots, for instance, to see how they work in industrial context, whether they're being deployed in a full production environment for the long term. And as mentioned, we're only really concerned with private networks based on LTE or 5G. There's a significant base of organisations currently operating networks based on older technologies, and we'll be monitoring whether those move over to LTE or 5G. If we look at those based on LTE and 5G today that we know about, LTE is used in 3/4 of 528 private mobile network deployments for which we have data. So I should say that in our database we have varying information for every deployment, depending on how much information has been made publicly available. We can share subsets of that depending on what's been shared confidentially or not. But LTE in 75% of those deployments, and perhaps surprisingly, 5G is either already being deployed or planned for deployment in nearly 30% of all those networks, with both technologies used in around about 5% of them. Where a deployment is identified as 5G ready, we only count it as an LTE deployment. We would adjust that categorization if and when 5G is added. Whether it's intended as a pilot project or whether a full production network is being deployed is not always possible to determine. End users and contracted vendors don't always make that information available, and of course in the case of a license award there may be no information at all about the planned use of the spectrum. What GSA's data does show, however, is that over 85% of the 184 classifiable deployments involving LTE are production deployments. Now that's a significant number that have moved beyond just pilot projects. The percentage is a bit lower for 5G, but it still shows significant commitment to the technology. The other thing that we are monitoring is the geographic scale of deployments, and at the moment we do that in give deployments 2 ratings. We either classify private mobile networks as LANs, local area networks. So these are single sites or campus networks with individual sites connected within a reasonably constrained area. Or we categorize them as WANs, wide area networks. These could be regional, citywide, or national networks. When information is not available about the nature of a deployment, or it's not clear if the organization has started to use its license, GSA uses information where possible about the type of organization, its activities, and the coverage or scale of an awarded license to classify it as a probable LAN or a probable WAN. So, for instance, we might know that its license has only been awarded, for instance, for one site, or we might know that it's only being deployed in a very small area for one organisation. But in some cases, no determination is possible, in which case the classification to be confirmed is used. As might be expected, local area network deployments outnumber wide area network deployments. There are nearly 3 times as many confirmed LANs as WANs. And if we take into account the probable LANs and probable WANs that we've identified, that rises to a factor of 4 times. And we should expect this disparity to continue, to increase in fact, as there are many more potential users of smaller local networks than large regional or nationwide ones. Key wide area network builders that we've catalogued have included rail companies, utilities, cities building smart infrastructure, communications providers, sometimes building networks for emergency services, or customers needing wide area coverage for mission critical systems. Spectrum's available for private mobile networks in a number of ways. Unlicensed spectrum solutions use LTE or 5G to build a network using spectrum that's freely available for public use, such as the spectrum band set aside globally at 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz that are already widely used for Wi-Fi. There are various approaches, including use of unlicensed spectrum alongside licensed bands or on its own. There are shared spectrum solutions which enable the use of the same spectrum in range in a single geographic area by more than one organization. And there's exclusively assigned spectrum, which can be used where either a public operator provides a private network as a service, using the spectrum it's been allocated to run public networks, or where it subleases its spectrum to the private network operator, or alternatively, where the national regulator or government has specifically allocated spectrum to be used for local private networks. In many countries, utilities and emergency services have historically been allocated dedicated slices of spectrum for their private networks, although many would argue they need more spectrum going forward to enable new, more advanced data transfer and video-based services. With the arrival of 5G, regulators in many countries are considering allocating or are already allocating more spectrum to enable private network deployment, with the aim of enabling and encouraging digital industry development. GSAs collating data about the licensed spectrum being used in private mobile networks or being licensed for private and local networks worldwide. And you can see here we've identified 6 bands so far in the low band range that are being used in deployments: 450, 600, 700, 800, 850 and 900 megahertz. There's 8 bands in the mid-band range and 3 bands so far in the high band range, so-called millimeter wave ranges. Millimeter wave spectrum is interesting in that it opens up the possibility for high capacity small cells in densely populated areas, and it's being made available in a variety of countries around the world, with some of the spectrum made available specifically for local networks. More countries are currently planning to make millimeter wave spectrum available over the next couple of years, and GSA will be tracking which of those set aside specific spectrum ranges for local private networks and will be reporting on it. Looking at the chart, we can see that C-band spectrum is the most deployed at the moment by a long way. I've split out CBRS, which of course sits within the C-band range, as the way it's been assigned is rather different. We've only included in our counts here and in our database CBRS spectrum holders that have committed to or are already deploying private networks based on LTE or 5G using CBRS spectrum. In the 3.3 to 3.8 gigahertz range, there are a lot of licensees in Germany, and we have counted those, but those licenses are much more local and specifically designed for local and private networks. After C-band, we've identified a number of utility users of spectrum at 410 to 450 gigahertz, and then there are quite a few deployments appearing within the 2.5, 2.6 gigahertz range and at the 1.8 gigahertz range. And then there's a long tail of other spectrum bands that are being used. So who's deploying private mobile networks? GSA is tracking on an ongoing basis the types of organizations gaining license or deploying private mobile networks, and the chart here shows the data we have for organizations globally. GSA's data shows that manufacturing is an early adopter of local area private mobile networks, with over 100 identified companies holding suitable licenses or involved in known pilots or deployments of LANs or probable LANs, up from 51 at the start of 2021 that we knew about. So that number's more than doubled. And what I should say is we track organizations, we don't track networks. So for instance, we are aware of a number of organizations, a number of manufacturers that are putting in private networks in many of their factories within a country, and that would be counted as one deployment in our numbers. So the number of actual installations is much higher than the number of organizations that we've catalogued. After manufacturing, mining follows second with 56 identified organisations deploying LANs. So you need to look at the lighter blue bars on the charts there rather than the total heights of the bars on the chart. With ports, 36 organisations also actively trialling or deploying local area private networks. Meanwhile, the data suggests that utilities, a grouping of police, security, public safety and defence, then separately communications and IT, and rail are the biggest users of wide area private mobile networks at the moment, based on LTE or 5G. Companies in the communications and IT sector are key investors in private mobile networks, although data is not always available to determine whether their activities encompass local or wide area applications. Their licenses are often held covering multiple locations, could be used for multiple LAN deployments for separate clients, or for wide area deployments, especially when those permits have been applied for at different times. What is clear, though, is that after manufacturing, communications and IT companies are the second biggest group of license holders, enabling some sort of LTE 5G network deployment for private mobile networks. Interestingly, GSA's data shows that although we're talking about private networks here, public network operators are not excluded from the market, and far from it, in fact. Our database catalogues at the moment 71 public network operators, the majority of the mobile operators, involved in at least 187 of all the private network deployments for which we have data. There's a strong and diverse supply side to the market too. We've identified nearly 50 equipment vendors actively involved in the supply of technology for private mobile networks installations. These include companies supplying the RAN equipment, core equipment, and the customer equipment. So we've said that manufacturing's leading the way. Within manufacturing, which sectors are leading the way? I thought it was worth having a quick closer look at this. We've subcategorized the manufacturing sector to see which types of manufacturer are active. And as you can see, automotive manufacturers represent the biggest identified group. What we've noticed is a good number of projects from process manufacturers as well as discrete manufacturers, and a wide variety of different types. 5G deployment by manufacturers is running at nearly 50% of identified deployments, and only marginally behind LTE deployment at this stage in terms of project numbers of any type. Production deployments represent nearly half of all investments we've identified, with license acquisitions at nearly 15%, pilot projects the same, and 26% still to be confirmed. And the types of applications that manufacturers are using private networks for are very often production line automation, industrial site automation, linking up equipment, sensors, and trying to improve processes and time to market through digitalization. So the slides I've presented here have given a snapshot of the private mobile network data available from GSA. That data is collected and maintained by the GSA, and it's available to members and associates. The information is made available in regular reports. There's one out today, including a version for members and associates that encompasses the database of organisations deploying private networks. That's the publicly announced deployments only. The next one after that is planned for November. We've also introduced a searchable data set on GSA's Gambod database, which gets monthly updates. So please tell us about spectrum allocations, licenses, deployments, or innovative use cases, emailing us at research@gsacom.com so that we can keep our data sets as up to date as possible and provide the best possible service to you. Thank you for listening. It is a snapshot webinar, so we keep them brief. We're now going to take questions for a few minutes. If you have any more to ask, please submit them now, and we'll do our best to answer them. Thank you for listening.
Great, thank you, Simon. So lots of questions, and please do continue to submit them through the questions tab. Perhaps if we start with some regarding just clarifying definitions that you've used in terms of how you've categorized things. regarding the technologies being used on, I think it's slide 6, private network deployments by status. Could you just clarify when you say license and production deployment, what exactly you mean by those sort of two categorizations?
Okay, yeah, so licensed means, for instance, the German regulator or the Japanese regulator has awarded a spectrum license to that organization that's intended to be used for private or local network deployment, and which could be used to deploy an LTE or 5G network. So we wouldn't count it if they've been awarded a license, but they had to use Tetra, for example.
Fantastic. And
oh, sorry, the other question about production deployments. Yes, so pilots literally using the technology to test what the potential is, to try it out, not necessarily intending to keep it on an ongoing basis. Production deployments, literally deploying the technology with the intention that it's going to stay in use. It's going to be their network going forward. It's not just going to be taken out after the end of a quick test or pilot project.
Great. And regarding, I think, slide 9 on who is deploying private networks, again, just some clarification on definitions. When you're talking about communications and IT organizations, give me an idea of exactly sort of who would be included within that.
Service providers and systems integrators. So we within the manufacturing, sorry, actually it depends which side you're talking about. So we count communications and IT providers in a couple of places. Mm-hmm. So as organizations deploying private mobile networks, there's one group that are service providers and systems integrators, and they are the significant body of organizations that I talked about earlier holding licenses. So, and they may be acquiring licenses or building networks on behalf of their customers, or sometimes they're building demonstrator networks within their own headquarters or in other locations to enable their customers to come and try out infrastructure. Separately, we track manufacturers producing communications and IT equipment under the manufacturing category.
Great stuff. And just again, sticking on slide 9, and I think the answer is other. But the question is, where would you put something like racing tracks, motor racing tracks that have a private network, for example? What, I guess, maybe the other way of phrasing the question is, what sort of things are included within that large other bucket?
Yeah, well, it does include race tracks. It includes retail parks. It includes a variety of different types of municipal or government organization or certain charities. There's a right mix in there. And what I would say is that going forward, we will be refining these definitions and splitting more of them out to give a more granular view. But one of the things we're trying to do in advance of that is agreeing with the members within the GSA who are major players in this space what the best categorizations would be. But yeah, certainly sports tracks, race tracks are currently in that other category.
Thank you. Again, I think you have touched on this already, but just a couple of questions on it. Clarifying sort of deployments or installations versus organizations. Again, just clarifying that what is included within that number and how, I guess, installations is a potentially very different number from the number of organizations.
Sorry, which slide are we referring to? Sorry, Richard.
When we're talking about the total number of deployments, and we're talking about the 626 companies.
Yes. So we're talking about organizations which are individual entities, as opposed to the number of networks that they may be installing. So, for instance, there might be one manufacturer who is installing multiple private networks in different locations around a country. We would count different national versions of a company as different organizations, though. So, for instance, trying to think of an entirely neutral name Well, let's say you've got a washing machine manufacturer in the UK and it also has a subsidiary in Germany. We would count those as different organisations for purposes of deployment. Installations would be, if you were to count the number of installations, you'd be counting the number of specific networks.
Okay, so if one brand has lots of factories, it's one organisation, but lots of installations. Yeah. And we've had a few questions sort of wanting to dig into the detail, but lots of that's detail which is in Gambod, which is obviously available to GSA members and GSA associates. Perhaps you could just give a flavour of some of the more detailed data that is available within Gambod.
Gambod generally, or within this particular
this,
data set. Sorry.
Knock yourself out.
Well, okay. So within the database, it provides the names, the countries, the size of the network, the spectrum bands used, the sector of the organisation, and the network technologies used. Where we have that information and where it hasn't been supplied confidentially is all available on a searchable basis.
Fantastic. And Joe, this is probably just one closing question for you, which I know you have answered on the chat already, but just generally to share with people, if an entity has deployed a private network, what's the incentive for reporting this to GSA for inclusion in the database?
Yes, I did answer, but obviously what we are doing and within the private network interest group is so the vendors who are participating in that group as part of our membership are trying to get a good idea of the size of the industry, of this segment. And so they are coming together and providing information on their deployments that can go into a database, so we can say this market is this size, which is good for the industry as a whole to understand, is that market growing? Can we see growth? How quick is that growth, etc. And so that's a good incentive. But as this information increases, the whole industry will, through the reports that we're producing, will get a better idea of what is happening within this segment, what spectrum bands are being used, etc. And that's interesting information, especially for companies that are now coming into this area of the market. I think we've seen a lot of companies, new entrants, startups, and existing players, and companies coming from adjacent industries looking at mobile as a solution and looking at what type of services and even software that they can provide to support the segment. So it's really is about supporting decision making within the industry for a wide range of companies, and obviously the more accurate our information, the better it is for people to understand.
Great, thank you very much. I think we've managed to cover off most of the questions. If we didn't address your question directly, then apologies. We are overrunning. We do want to try and keep this as a snapshot. As Simon says, if you do have any more information about spectrum allocations, licenses, deployments to share with the team and get included in the database, please do share them with Simon at research@gsacom.com. And with that, I'll bring today's snapshot webinar to a close. And again, once again, thank you for joining us. After the event, you will receive a link, an email with the webinar recording, and also a link to download the latest private mobile networks report from gsacom.com. So that is an executive summary. The more detailed information, as Joe and Simon said, is available in the Gambod database. So all the data you've seen today is taken from the Gambod database, and that is the most unique search analysis tool containing the most up-to-date information on 4G and 5G devices, networks, technologies, and spectrum. And as an industry resource, it's available to all employees of GSA executive and member companies and to GSA associates who are subscribing to the service. Our next event is on the 27th of October, and is the GSA 4G 5G Fixed Wireless Access Forum plenary session. And for that, we'll be bringing together operators, regulators and vendors to share best practice on driving global adoption of fixed wireless access services. For all the latest updates on GSA research and activities, I do encourage you to follow GSA on our social channels. You'll find Global Mobile Suppliers Association on Twitter, LinkedIn, WeChat and Weibo. And if you visit gsacom.com, you're able to subscribe to the weekly research digest and new report notifications. On behalf of Joe, Simon and the team, all that remains for me to say is once again, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon at the next GSA event. Many thanks.